Hello all, welcome to TechGrit Talks. Thank you for spending next 45 minutes with us. Uh, I want to start with a number, 4 months. This is how long it took Uber to spend entire 2026 budget. Not 4 months of overspending, it's 4 months they burned their entire 2026. It's a company, they spent around 3.5 bill on R&D last year. They can afford it. But the problem is not the money. It's about they were not sure where the money was gone. So this is exactly the problem, not with Uber. Other companies, good technology companies like Microsoft, pulled cloud code licenses from its own developers months after they handed over. And Tesla capped AI to $200 per week for their developers. And Amazon shut down its internal token leaderboard as people started gaming the system. Likewise, Walmart did it, Priceline did it. All those, everybody started worrying about it. Now, none of them made a mistake with AI. They adopted fast, but that's the right call. But they crossed the line where they didn't know that what's the line about. They started seeing these sticker shocks when they are seeing the invoices. So we're not telling that AI is expensive. You already know that. We are here because most organizations cannot answer a much simpler question. Where did it go and was it worth it? TechGrit is a technology services company between Dallas and Hyderabad, it's an headquarters. We build and modernize software for other companies, mostly mid-market, healthcare, financial, consumer, lending, and construction technology. We are not managing a product internally. We are managing it across the portfolio of client engagements. We are seeing this problem day in, day out. My question is not how much we spent on AI last month, is about how much we spent on which client, which project, and which phase. Without that information, it would be difficult for us to continue deliver within the budget and scope. So this is the topic today, AI cost and US usage management. And Keith Bottner is the founder of Axemere, who ran into this problem in his own work. I'm going to tell him that the story that he's going to share, not about today is not a product which we were talking about it. How can we help the community of people to realize that how this can be managed and realize it, how to spend it effectively? Keith, welcome to the floor, and floor is yours.
Thank you, Jitu. I appreciate the introduction. So over the past year, I've been using AI heavily across a number of projects and different models, different providers. And like many of you, AI gradually became part of my workflow, right? I really wasn't thinking much about which provider I was using or what it was costing. I had simply become another tool that helped me get my work done faster, right? And then one day, in the middle of my workflow, it just stopped. I ran out of tokens. Now, running out of tokens isn't that interesting, really. I could have increased the budget, upgraded my subscription, or simply waited until the next billing cycle. But what happened next is what changed my thinking, because my first reaction wasn't, I need more tokens. It was, what happened? Which project burned through the budget? Which model consumed the tokens? Was this expected? Was somebody experimenting? Did something change? Those all felt like perfectly reasonable questions. So I did what I suspect many of you would have done. I logged into one provider dashboard and exported my usage report, then another, and then another. And I started comparing invoices, trying to remember which API keys belong to which people and projects, trying to figure out what had happened. And then I realized something. I couldn't answer what should have been a very ordinary operational question. The interesting part wasn't that I'd run out of tokens. The interesting part was realizing I'd crossed a threshold. AI had gone from something I experimented with to something I needed to manage. And then another thought hit me. We've been here before. Let me explain what I mean. Every major technology wave follows the same pattern. When the internet first emerged, nobody talked about internet operations. There was one web server, one website, and one administrator. There wasn't much to manage. But then organizations began to rely on it. Applications multiplied, infrastructure multiplied. Eventually, we created an entirely new operational discipline because we had to. And cloud followed exactly the same pattern. At first, it was simple: one AWS account, one credit card, a handful of virtual machines, and then organizations scaled. Multiple cloud providers, hundreds of services, unexpected bills, new operational challenges. Eventually, we created cloud operations and then FinOps. And that's when it clicked for me. Every major technology wave eventually shifts from an innovation problem to a management problem. And AI isn't breaking that pattern, it's following it.
Yeah, Keith, I wanted to put a stake on that. It's not metaphor anymore, right? In June, just a fact here, Linux Foundation launched the Tokenomics Foundation. Its entire job is to define open standards and benchmarks for the economics of AI. They built this along with FinOps Foundation. FinOps Foundation is the one they really built it for the cloud era. In fact, FinOps X, the conference they generally conduct every year, they are renaming that conference into the tokenomics. So it's real. It started this summer, so they are defining the standards for this. So with that, yeah, let me help you. Yeah, please.
And I think that's the big difference, right? The difference is simply where organizations are, right, on that journey today. Most organizations today aren't fully dependent on AI, right? They're somewhere in the middle of this journey. At first, AI is personal. One developer, one marketer, one analyst. Someone discovers they can get work done faster. Then teams begin adopting it. People start sharing prompts, building workflows, finding repeatable use cases, right? And their productivity increases and everyone gets excited. But eventually, something changes. Organizations start asking completely different questions. Not, can AI help us? But how do we manage AI across the business? How much are we spending? Who's using it? Which teams? Which projects? Which models are we using? And with which providers? And how do we budget? How do we scale it responsibly? And I think that's the threshold we're crossing as an industry. The moment you start asking operational questions about AI is the moment you've outgrown treating AI as an experiment.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Keith. If I have to interject a little bit here, in the last slide you were mentioning about, that's where I think I can speak our story, TechGrit. We started as an individual experimentation 2 years back when GPT came into picture, but we quickly adopted as in a team level. But now it's an organizational issue. People generally assume that this is a Fortune 500. Organizational scaling is a Fortune 500 problem. It is not, because anybody like services company like us are providing a multi-product lines. It's a problem, right? They need to know that it's not about the which team spending it. It's about how much we are spending on each client. That's the problem we are seeing it. So I think would like to know more about it. Yeah, please.
And across multiple clients, that's even a multiplicative problem, right? So it's
Correct.
not just your work. So
Right.
I started talking to other technology leaders like Jittu, right? I spoke with CTOs, engineering leaders, founders, IT organizations. And regardless of industry, I kept hearing the same questions, not technology questions, right? Management questions, questions that every organization eventually asks once AI becomes part of how work gets done. And that's when I realized something else.
Yeah.
The real problem isn't that AI costs money, right? Organizations expect that. The
Right.
real problem is uncertainty, right? Executives can budget for investment. What they struggle with is not knowing where it is going, why it is increasing, who's driving it, and whether they're getting value from it, right? They don't lack AI, they lack visibility. And once you have visibility, you can make better decisions.
Yeah,
You can
exactly right.
optimize. I'm sorry?
Yeah, exactly right. Keith, just wanted to interfere there. In our case, if you see that, let's say it happened with Uber, they announced it. Um, for their engineers, average, it was taking around $500 to $2,000 per month, right? If you do the math there, 5 engineers working on a product or a project, it's costing around low end $2,000 to higher end the $10,000, right? Now you can extrapolate to the teams. Now in our case, if you see that services company, if we it's hitting us margin. If we go with the fixed fee project for multiple clients, we are working on it. If if you don't consider the cost of the tokens, we will be hitting our margins, the low end itself. And then if you are hitting the margins to the, if you are hitting to the tokens cost to the high end, it's completely, that's the margin that we operate at. Likewise for the products budget also. So I think this is where the time where we stop, experimentation is done. It's the time to really start thinking about how to optimally use that. Back to you, Kate.
Yeah. And that visibility, it lets you optimize, right? It lets you budget, govern, scale. Without that visibility, you're managing AI on intuition, right? You're managing it with visibility, then you have the information. So after realizing all of this, I decided to build myself something to answer these questions. And let me show you what that became. Not because these dashboards are the important part, because they're not, right? The important part is having answers. So let's answer some of those questions, right? Earlier, I mentioned that I had to export reports from multiple providers and compare invoices manually. Now I don't. So let me switch on over and share with you what I am switching over to.
So it's going to answer for people like us who are managing the portfolio of projects. It's going to answer at the client level, project level, phase level, Kate.
Yes, yes. So the first thing I want to know every day when I come in is I want to know every morning what's happening at a high level, right? Just a general usage report. How much are we spending? What's it look like? Obviously, you can do smaller trends on 7 days and see how things are happening the last week. You can see how things are going over the last month. Personally, the one that's always the most closest to my heart is the one that's over the current billing period. I want to know how much money I've spent this billing period, and to a certain extent, what is that forecast and where is it going to land towards the end of the billing period? And this is one of the most important high level kind of reports I look at every morning. But then I really want to know, where's the money going, right? And like Jitu mentioned, we have a number of projects, and these are the projects that Axemere is running. And across these projects, we're using different AI providers, different AI models. But I want to know by project, how much money am I spending on that project, regardless of which provider, regardless of what workload I'm using. And this is a kind of view that gives you that comprehensive piece that I was looking for from the providers eventually, right? What is driving this usage? Which project is the most that's going on during this billing period? Different development projects. But then I really want to see, right, who's driving that usage. So I can switch from project to workloads, right? Is it engineering that's really driving that cost, right? Is it business development that's driving that cost? Running all their research. Is it the operations agent that we have that's a agentic agent that sits back there and monitors operations and reports to us when there's potentially issues that are coming up inside the infrastructure, right? Is it monitoring alerts and incidents? So once again, each one of these can break down. Think of it as a pivot table where you have a major pivot, and from that major pivot, you can see how all those other dimensions attribute to that particular piece. And then, of course, I'm always interested in exactly where am I spending my money on models? Which models am I using the most? Which providers am I using? And once again, it's a pivot table. You go to the model, you can see, oh, this Cloud Sonnet model is the one we're using. This is the one that it's using across these projects the most, right? What those costs are, what those attribute to. So this is kind of the information I like to see. I like to see the high level first. Then I like to see the project breakdown. Okay, where's the money going in the project? Then I like to understand the workload. Is it the business and analyst pieces that are going on? Is it the developers that are driving it? What's driving it? And then I like to understand, okay, well, where am I spending that money and with whom? Which providers? And then of course, this is all great, right? But it's information. But what you really need to do is you need to make sure that you're capturing that budget. Like, okay, well, does that project I have a budget so I can make sure that I get alerted if I'm approaching the edge of the budget? Does it have a cap where I can make it so that if I approach that budget, it's just a hard stop, and I just say, hey, listen, this open source project that we're doing and we're providing I only want to spend so much per month on that, and when it hits the cap, I'm done, and we're not spending any more money on that open source project. Or business development. I allow business development only a certain amount of money to run through their Lang chain. Once again, you can have a hard cap or you can just have an alert that it notifies you through different kinds of channels. And then eventually, too, one of the things that we got to keep up with, which is very important to me, too, is verifying credentials for us, right? We like having centralized key management that you can revoke and rotate as needed. It might be because you change who necessarily is doing some work for you. It might be because the key that you set for a various provider only runs for 30 days and you need to get a new key rather than all your workloads having to be updated in code and all of those particular pieces. You can just rotate it in one part. So ultimately, though, the point isn't that Axemere has dashboards. That's not what I'm trying to get to. The point I'm really trying to get to is that every one of these screens answers one of those questions I had before when I ran out of tokens. And my answer wasn't buy more tokens. My answer was, where did it go? Why did it go? And each one of these answers those questions. And honestly, I don't think I'm alone. I think there's more than just me who's interested in those questions.
Yeah, I think I would like to highlight that our experience, Keith, exactly the problem. It's not that individual service providers are not giving the dashboards. They are giving it, but they care about their service. But now, as we have to use multiple models to smartly use it for the specific kind of work, let's say in our case, we are using for the delivery cycle or the development cycle, we have an agent for each different, whether you are doing an investigation on the client code or whether you're doing the design, architecture, or the development and the testing, all the phases, each agent is there. You don't need the same model for the all the kind of the work. But we couldn't able to see that as in a one view, and the engineering staff was stuck on when they're capping up there. So this is going to give us for the management exactly the same thing to see that where the spend is going, what kind of a model should be used for this. Let me ask you a question, Keith. When you are building it, that you are living with this problem like many of us, what was the hardest part to build this one?
The hardest part was bringing all the data together across the multiple providers. Everybody responds a little bit differently on their models. They price their models a little bit differently. One of the things that's always an ongoing, I want to say, well, almost an exploration. An ongoing
Mhm.
exploration is how they're charging for models changes, which I don't think a lot of people realize. I think a lot of engineers go in and they say, oh, Anthropic is charging so much for input tokens and so much for output
Mhm.
tokens. And it's like, well, actually, they charge for if you hit the cache, and they have cache, 5 minute cache and 60-minute cache. And depending on what's in the cache depends on whether you're paying a certain amount of money. So it's not just like it was the very beginning, tokens in and tokens out.
Mhm.
OpenAI is doing the same thing where they're doing cache hisses and cache misses. Gemini is now doing what they call complexity, which has to do with how big the input tokens are that you're sending it and that they're sending back to you. So keeping up with it is not as simple as it used to be when it first started with tokens in and tokens out. And these models change on a daily basis. So the most difficult part, honestly, is
Mhm.
just continuously keeping up with how the pricing is changing and making sure it stays accurate, and then doing the cross-dimensional pivots so that you can
Mhm.
see this model is tied to this project, that's tied to this gateway, that's tied to this workload, that's tied to this key value pair that you've defined for that particular workload.
Awesome. That's the problem. Everybody living it, but don't have enough time to really spend. Right. These kind of a gateway solutions is the way to go. That's what is happening with in the marketplace too. Would love to share some data. Right. Yeah. Please keep going on the demo.
So the pieces that I think are important here that to keep in mind is like I said, depending on how you want to attach it. So we have certain workflows. We use LangChain, and LangChain pulls together business development for us. And we have it go out and we have it like go ahead and look at our competitors and pull competitor data and go pull data, find out, who their customers are and pulling all those data together. We actually use multiple models to actually do
Hmm.
multiple of those steps. And then we pull those together and then we analyze those models together with other models to generate a report. But the interesting piece about that is I'm using multiple providers and multiple models in a
Hmm.
complex workflow, but I can also track exactly what part of that workflow is costing me a certain amount of money. Is it the analysis part? Is it the going out and searching the part? Is it bringing it all together in a synchronized report? And then I can actually tell you, well, that LangChain run that ran across 8 different agents and took this much time and generated this many tokens actually cost, I don't know, $1.25 to run every time I run it. And I can tell that explicitly on what those pieces are. And on the small scale, it doesn't sound that impressive, right? Oh,
Right.
$1.25, what does it matter? You're right. $1.25, it doesn't matter. What matters is when it's $1,250 and you're running it five
Hmm.
times a day, right? And then the important part, just like the $1.25 part, is which part of that flow cost the most money so that you can
Hmm.
drill down and you can figure out why, right? And that's how we do this. That's why we have simple key value pairs that you can attach. You can see these individual runs right here, that we label by time date. So when we run through and it runs through LangChain, we can find out everything that went through that run ID, and it pulls all the records, all the models that got hit, and which workloads they were and which pieces those cost, right? And you can pull all that up and you can figure out what part of it costs the most. And then you can optimize because you need the visibility, right?
Hmm.
And then once you have the visibility, you need to be able to optimize it. And that's
Right.
the key, right? Optimizing. And the future is even more dynamic than what we're doing now.
Would we
Jitsu
be able to?
mentioned.
Yeah, would we be able to, as we are, start using these, right, gateway and understand the patterns? Now, if we wanted to automatically detect that what kind of a model need to be used for which work, right? Would that be able to do that?
Yes, yes. One of the things that Jitu mentioned earlier is optimizing cost is sometimes about figuring out like this model is a lot cheaper and it'll do this job just fine. So stop using the top of the line model. And engineers have a tendency to, when a brand new model comes out, they want to apply that model to everything, right? And the thing is, though, is that the optimized model isn't necessarily the most brand spanking new model that came out, right? So if you have a model that optimizes to a particular workload and it's far more cost efficient, then that's what you would want to address. Now, we have something that we're calling dynamic modeling, which is or dynamic routing, which is on a future roadmap that we're working
Hmm.
on. And the whole idea there is the same thing, but it's actually at a multiple levels, right?
Hmm.
It's, hey, this model is actually provided by 6 different providers. And today we pulled the numbers and this provider is, I don't know, 25% cheaper than this provider. It's the same model. If you're using that model, we're just going to use this provider today because it's 25% cheaper and we're going to save you 25% of the value, right? And that's a
Right.
simple routing rule that dynamic routing starts on. And then you start getting more complex and you start breaking away from, I want to use Claude Sonnet through
Hmm.
AWS Bedrock. And you start thinking about, wait a second, I need a model capable of this workload with these security requirements under this latency, and I want it to be the most cost effective. And that's a fundamentally different abstraction, right? That's a fundamentally different way of asking for that to be handled. And that's all going to be part of dynamic routing where it'll switch different providers on price, which will be the simplest thing. And then
Hmm.
it'll switch on ability, which will be the next thing, as well as latency requirements, as well as you might have a very complex workflow and
Hmm.
you want to use a particular model. Okay, well, if there's 10 providers that provide that model, you could split your workload across those 10
Hmm.
providers and get it back 10 times faster. So
Right.
depending on what your requirements are not necessarily just model requirements. Some of them
Right.
are fundamental business requirements of what you're trying to accomplish.
Right. I think one of the good examples, Keith, while many of the companies started thinking about putting a caps on it as they are seeing right in a hard way, if they don't have any gateway availability, right, they're spending time to go to each individual service and see that, but they are putting a caps on it. But Coinbase is the one I was reading an article where what they did, they could reduce the spend by half of it by applying the smart routing of it, understanding it, where the model watch model is the right one to
Mhm.
tell the people, right, they could spend it. So if they have tools like this, right, then they would be able to, right, all of us would be able to reduce the spend. We don't need to put a caps on it so that engineering staff need to create a ticket to give me more tokens for that. It's been interesting. Yeah, please keep going.
Yeah, yeah, and you're absolutely correct. And it was very elucidating
Mhm.
when we automated pulling in provider pricing for
Right.
models across different providers, um, which sounds trivial, but is more complicated than you would think.
Right.
But the interesting thing that we found out was that provider pricing
Hmm.
isn't just about isn't just about the amount of tokens in or out, right?
Hmm.
Provider pricing starts to be more about uh, pricing rules, right? Cache
Hmm.
hits
Hmm.
and optimization. So going back to what you were saying, there's actually a special mode inside of Anthropic. And there's one
Hmm.
inside of OpenAI. They don't exactly line up, but they're very similar. And it's a 60-minute cache. And you're like,
Hmm.
what's a 60-minute cache? And it's like, well, you load the 60-minute cache with a bunch of context. And as long as you keep using that context, it stays in the 60-minute cache, and you don't have to keep paying for it to be tokenized every time it goes in. Currently, old models, what happens is they keep taking that same thing and shoving in as input tokens every time you request, and it builds up this
Hmm.
context, right? But
Correct.
this longer term context you can put in there, and it'll last up to 60 minutes, which is useful if you're using an interactive
Hmm.
a kind of like LLM kind of a based system. And then they also have a 5-minute cache, which is much more of if you got a bunch of agentic agents and they're working on something very, very quickly, then you really only need the 5-minute cache. And it costs more money to put something in the 5-minute cache, and it costs more money to put something in the 60-minute cache than it does normally. But the amount that you would save over using that sticks in the cache versus sending that over and over and over again and it being retokenized is where you start to optimize some of that budget and really drill down on those costs. And quite frankly, You have no idea how to do that if you don't
Hmm.
have the kind of visibility necessary to understand how much you're spending, which models you're spending it on, why you're
Hmm.
spending it, what the breakdown was on that model. Did it hit the cache? Did it not hit the cache? How do I optimize it? And when you start having that visibility and you start being able to see where the data is coming from, that makes it so much easier for you to do that optimization yourself to figure out how to optimize those models.
Nice. So the features wise, when do we expect this dynamic routing? Because that's one of the things where now Open Router, if you see that that might be the same reason Stripe bought Open Router for 7 point, right, some billions recently. And the Palo Alto bought the port key recently and added into folded into their security space. And recently, Databricks also announced that Unity Catalog is the gateway, the right there gateway for this all these models to smartly route it. Um, so what when they are available, why do people need to go with the independent gateways like this?
It's interesting because I know that Gartner actually reflected on the Palo Alto buying Portkey. And what Gartner said is they said you need to separate out how you're monitoring
Hmm.
what you're purchasing from the provider that you're using. And I think there's a lot of reasons behind that. Obviously, I don't work at Gartner. I don't know what
Hmm.
the behind the heads thinking was. But to me, it's about who who is really motivated for you to
Hmm.
cut back your spending, right? Is a provider that tells you how much you're using really motivated to help you optimize all of your spend? And if they do optimize it, I bet you they optimize it inside that provider because they don't
Hmm.
have visibility into other providers or what you might be using in other providers. So I think to a certain extent, having a third party that's not necessarily tied to a provider gives you visibility across providers, allows you to optimize across providers, and gives you more choices than necessarily being tied to one particular provider, being tied to one particular provider. So I think Gartner sees that. I obviously can't speak to their exact reasoning, but after reading about how they kind of reflected on that versus the Palo Alto Network's port key piece, that is my feeling. Is they're kind of treating it in that way, and I don't blame them, right? I mean, a third party provider that's able to dynamic route. I know that our dynamic routing is going to start. You're going to probably start seeing the first pieces of it in the next few weeks, and then we're going to start actually increasing more towards, like I said, that business requirement side, right? Which is more of like being able to say, hey, I've got rules. I need these latency, these security requirements, because it might very well be too. The cheapest
Right.
model might very well be available to you, but it might be not necessarily in a country that you're allowed to send data to because of some kind of oversight that your company is under, and so you can't send data to that country, so you can't use that model. So there'll be those kinds of restrictions as well, where you can say, well, we can't send it to certain places because of our data access rules and those kinds of things. So that's all part of it, and those will be rolling out, like I said, the first part probably in the next several weeks, and then we'll start rolling out more complex scenarios that help people. So you don't have to do a lot of the manual pieces, but you're
Hmm.
still going to want to see that visibility.
Right, right. So I know we are using TechGrit Axemere and we are greatly benefited. We haven't adapted for all the clients, but good chunk of our internal work and the clients' work we are doing it because generally R&D is the one other work you burn the tokens quickly, right? In addition to the modernizations. I wanted to ask you, I know you've been clear with me on the Axemere side. If you don't configure some of the agent calls through the Axmere, what is that we are going to miss out?
Yeah, Axmere does take a little bit of configuration, and part of it is to your benefit. Pulling those keys out of the code so that the keys aren't in the code, they don't get checked into GitHub, right? Centralizing the credentials, which I mentioned earlier in the demo, helps
Mhm.
for rotating the keys as well as managing the keys. So part of that, just in general, are some changes you might need to make to your code. We do have two different ways to integrate into Axmere. One way is an API direct, which is right in your API. You make some calls. It's very simple, and you can get very specific on how things you want to identify. And then there's a upper level baseline like URL gateway that we utilize for a lot of the providers that support that, which gets you into the system a lot quicker. So
Mhm.
there's two different ways. If you're not tracking that
Mhm.
information, right, then you're losing out on that partial visibility, right? You're losing out if you're using it for some providers and not other providers, or some clients and not other clients. You're losing out on that holistic view of what providers you're using and how to optimize across those providers for those different clients, and potentially whatever clients are left out. What's that visibility into that? And I think that's the biggest part is when you do it, you kind of start to see the value of it. So you do start with one or two clients just to see how it is, and then or one or two projects, internally. And then once you start to see the visibility, you start saying, "Hey, wait a second, why aren't we using this with everything?" Because now I can see a bigger report across the whole spend, everything that we're spending across all the projects, and then you can start seeing cross project optimizations, which is only something you can see when you have that kind of visibility.
Awesome. We have a couple of questions before I start the Q&A session. Keith, the demo was useful. I know people can request the detailed demos when right they wanted to spend more time and configure. If somebody wants to try this out, Keith, what would be the smallest thing? What's the onboarding journey looks like to experiment, and what's the smallest thing they can do that?
Well, I think the first thing they need to figure out, it really is how they want to separate out their data.
Hmm.
Do you want to separate it out by workload? We configure workloads at Axemere as high level workloads. So Claude
Hmm.
CLI development is a workload.
Hmm.
Our business development LangChain is a workload. When we do any kind of SRE ops agentic agent, that's a workload. So we have a
Hmm.
high level workload. And then underneath that workload, we have different kinds of projects that are specific to that. So for our own personal internal development, each one of our services is a different project, right? And so we label each of those independently. And then, of course, for some of the things like the business development and some of the LangChain pieces, we actually tag those with value tags so that each run has a different piece. So it's really fundamentally about how you track your projects internally and what kind of details do you want to get per project. Do you want something that one customer all rolls up into one giant workload, and then each one of the projects you do for that customer is broken out, and then you can break down each one of those projects into something similar by key value pair? That's all potentially useful. But my biggest thing is knowing how you want to track that data to the granularity that you feel you need to report, whether it's financial or engineering, is
Hmm.
fundamentally the first thing you need to do. And for Axmere, simplest thing to do is to set up one workload with one project and to start getting data through with one provider and
Hmm.
on one model. And then once you start seeing the data come through, then start going, okay, now how does this apply to my daily work?
Right. So on behalf of the audience, I'm going to ask the question because we were in that ambiguity what to do. We have been using Open Router as a gateway for some of the models for consuming the API way of calling these agents. How does that work? If Open Router itself is gateway, would we be able to configure?
Yeah. Actually, Open Router is one of the providers. We have, I think, 23 providers currently. We've got more that we can add. The system is actually set up so if a provider that that uses the OpenAI protocol or the Anthropic protocol, you can actually add one in without waiting for us. And throw it in
Hmm.
there as a custom provider. You can even throw in how much the models cost for how much the models cost. Like for instance, we provide provider pricing that we pull through. But
Hmm.
say, for instance, you did a special deal with Anthropic and you got, I don't know, 50% off your tokens and you wanted to model it like that. You could go in there and override that pricing so it's 50% less. And all your attribution and cost would come through at that 50% less. If you're an organization like a TechGrit and say you're charging back your customers for the AI that you're using them, you can
Mhm.
actually bump the prices up a little bit for that overage cost because you're like, oh well, there's a certain amount that you pay on top of the amount that we pay.
Mhm.
You can do that as a fixed
Mhm.
percentage for a whole provider and say, hey, we're just going to charge 5% over whatever this provider charges, or you could do it actually per individual model. So there's lots of ways that you can actually handle that those cost usage. There's lots of ways you can add providers yourself, and then of course we're adding providers probably on a weekly basis,
Uh-huh.
especially if somebody sends us an email and says, hey, we use, I don't know, we use Quinn. It's like, okay, well, we'll get
Right.
Quinn done. They're all
Right.
relatively the same, although just recently there's some new authentication models, but we're integrating those as well. So yeah, you can use Open Router today if you want to.
Yeah. So on the similar note, there is a question here. I would like to piggyback on that. How does this work with Azure OpenAI?
Azure works as well, and OpenAI. It's interesting because I think Azure and AWS Bedrock, and I think there's a Google one
Um,
as well. They each have also a unique authentication standard that's slightly
uh-huh.
different than the standard providers, just using an API key.
Uh-huh.
And we support each one of them. We support that special authentication standard. I think one is called I can't remember off the top of my head. I think one is like V7 or something. But yes, we do support those. And
So,
actually, there's a new one coming out for Anthropic,
uh-huh.
which has just become a standard. It's called WIF, WIF or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And I would assume a lot of providers are going to be using that. And it's supposed to replace API credentials where the credentials are generated in real time and they only last for 120 seconds and then they kind of disappear. And then it generates a new credential on the fly, and we'll be supporting that standard as well. We've already started development on it so that we can integrate it in. And so for those customers in Anthropic that have to use that, then they'll be able to utilize that rather than the standard API keys.
Awesome. Another question. Do developers have to change any code?
Sometimes they do. I mean, to a certain extent, yes. I mean, sometimes it's removing the keys out of the code
Right.
because you're utilizing it through the gateway. If you want to get very specific, you can track by workload and by project. You can also track by, account ID, customer ID, key value pairs. So if you want to assign key value pairs like on the fly inside of our LangChain code, we've got code that actually goes, oh, we know that this run of this entire LangChain is we give it like an ID, UUID v7. And so we attach it as a key value pair. And then that way, when we go into the records, we can say, show me everything that came out of this LangChain, and it'll show me every request that went to a provider
Mhm.
because it's tagged with that key value pair. And just so we're clear, Axemere, we do not keep any of your prompts. We do not keep any of your responses at
Uh-huh.
all. It flows through the system and it's gone. We don't keep any of it. The only thing we do encrypt is the metadata that goes along with it, so that we can encrypt it and make sure that we can guarantee that you can guarantee that this was a request that you sent and it went to this provider. But we keep no prompts and we keep no responses.
So one last question, I think a few others you might have answered, like, can I start with one provider and expand later? You addressed a little bit, but I wanted to ask this one. How does pricing work? Before we wanted to have you three takeaways for our audience. We are at the top of the hour. I would like to have you explain on the pricing, how it works, and then takeaways.
So pricing for Axemere it typically is handled with like a standard gateway package, which actually there's going to be some additional packages rolling out that'll be a little bit easier from some smaller companies. And then high level packages for governance and some additional analytics you can opt into. So the whole idea is you kind of purchase the packages you need without buying in a bunch of packages that you don't. I don't think necessarily that smaller companies necessarily need the governance packages that are required for some financial institutions. So don't buy that package, right? That's an additional package. Stick with the lower level gateways and potentially the core platform, and that gives you the providers, the access, the keys, the gateways, a certain amount of alerts and caps on all those kinds of pieces. And so we try to price it so you're kind of buying what you need and not necessarily having to pay a bunch of money for things that you don't.
Super. Yeah. So before we wrap up, I'd like to have you give some three takeaways for our audience. There are a couple of
Sure.
questions there, Keith. We'll work with you to answer offline and we'll send it over. I would like to really hear from your perspective on the
Okay.
looking forward.
I'd probably say the big three takeaways are if you're not measuring it, you have no visibility, and with no
Mhm.
visibility, you can't optimize it, you can't govern it, and you really have no idea how you're growing. So that's takeaway one. Takeaway two is pricing and how things get charged in AI is almost a wild, wild west right now. Things are changing daily. I'm seeing models because we run a actually we run a report twice a day that pulls all the model pricing. And I can tell you there'll be a model that'll go up 200%, right? And there'll be a model that'll go down 25%, right? And so models go up and go down all the time. And models that didn't have cash pricing switch to cash pricing. So, you may think you're paying so much for a model, not necessarily true all the time. So it's something that you need to keep track of. We're even thinking potentially about starting a newsletter that just you subscribe to, and it just tells you what the prices have gone today, kind of like the market, like the Nasdaq. Well, these are the
Right.
model prices for today. They've gone up, they've gone down. you know? So,
Right.
uh, so so that's takeaway number two. Takeaway number three is if you've gotten to the point where you are really thinking about how to manage your AI, you've been successful. Congratulations. You've gotten out of
Right.
the prototype stage, right? You've gotten to the part of maturity where you're starting to blend it into your business. And that's
Right.
important, right? But it takes that next level of discipline. And that next level
Right.
of discipline is having that information so that you know how to govern it properly. And I encourage you to keep going down that road because that is something that is going to show definitively the winners that have truly integrated into their workflow over the next year or two.
Awesome. This is good. We're on top of the hour. Thank you very much, Keith. How do people find you?
You can email me at Keith, Keith, at Axemere.ai. I'm always available if you have a particular question. I'm always happy to talk about this topic. If you want to try out Axemere, you can go to axemere.com/demo and you get a guest account. You can see everything you saw here. You can go through Axemere's. It'll block out all the PII, but it'll still let you see all the data of Axemere. You can go there and check that out if you want. And we also have other demos that we can do, but just email me. I'm happy to talk through anything that you want on how to organize data, what you might need to track. I'm always available.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you, everyone. This is a wonderful, worth $1 million session, I believe, for many of us. So you know where to find Keith and me. LinkedIn. You guys can reach us out. We can schedule some dedicated topics and sessions. And I couldn't get to a lot of questions here, Keith. I will work with you, and we'll send the question and answers offline to the audience. Thank you
Happy to do
again,
so.
and have a good one. Bye bye.
Thank you.